Hey everybody, today I'm going to be reviewing Darling, and this is a film directed by Mickey Keating. Mickey Keating is a very young director that honestly I had no idea who he was before I watched this movie, but apparently he makes a lot of very low budget horror films, and this is his latest attempt at that. Darling is a love letter, basically, to horror films throughout the 20th century, but particularly I'd say in like the 1960s and the 70s. There's rarely a moment where you aren't thinking about the films that it's referencing, all the different cliches. It has a very shrill, very discordant score, a lot like Bernard Herrmann's score for Psycho, and there's certainly some imagery from Psycho that you do see in this film. And then there's also a lot of references, I think, to Roman Polanski. I think more than any other film I saw more in common with a film like Repulsion from the 1960s, as well as maybe a little bit of Rosemary's Baby, and then certainly The Shining, of course. Every horror movie has to reference The Shining, it seems like, in some form. And there's also a female as the protagonist in this film, and the way she's framed definitely reminded me of a lot of Polanski moments in some of his earlier films. But basically the movie's about a woman named, well, the actress is named Lauren Ashley Carter, who's somebody I was not familiar with before I saw the film. But she plays the caretaker of this big mansion in New York City. And of course the mansion has a very mysterious past, and it is known to be haunted. You could easily swap this plot synopsis for something like The Shining or pretty much almost any other cliche horror film, and you would barely know the difference. This mansion brings out the worst in this character, and I think that the mansion, in a way, kind of frames her psychological descent into madness. This movie doesn't seem to have a particular time in which it's set, but it is very, very influenced by the 1960s Manhattan look. The way that the character is dressed, a lot of kind of mini dresses, and her hair, she has like a very bouffant hairdo, which was of course very significant in the period. There are no cell phones or anything like that. Lots of like old record players and cigarettes, Audrey Hepburn style, very old telephones, and it's shot in black and white. So if that isn't an homage to the 1960s, then I don't know what is. What I really like about how it is able to take all of these elements of old horror movies is how it starts to kind of breathe new life into them. And when I say new life, I don't necessarily mean new ideas, but as the film goes on, it starts to become more and more modern, and it starts to pull more from even more of like the slasher kind of grunge horror movies of maybe the 70s and 80s. It just has very beautiful, very classical cinematography in terms of just the look of it. It's absolutely gorgeous. And then it starts to kind of snap at very unexpected moments, and it becomes this jolt of more modern cinematic styles, and it completely catches you off guard. And the way that the film progresses is very Tarantino-esque, and what I mean by that is that not only is it pastiching all the genres, or not the genres, but the different cliches together as he does, but it's also done in chapters, and the title cards will be a different color. I mean, it won't be black and white, it'll be like a bright pink or a bright red, and that brings in a lot of the more modern sensibilities. And there's also these like flashing kind of strobe light effects that are almost like lightning, with like these pops of very disturbing images that are always in unexpected moments. So as you can see, there are a lot of things about this that really intrigued me and that I was very excited by, but I have a lot of problems with this movie. I wanted to like it so much because clearly there's a lot to like here. If Tarantino were to make a horror movie, I think it would look so much like this, because the way that Keating is able to employ all of these cliches, it's so clever, and it makes it feel very new even though it isn't, and that is very difficult to do. I was very compelled by many kind of separate moments in the film, and I was also very disturbed by a lot of the images, and that's hard to do because I don't get disturbed easily. But, and this is a huge but, I love the style of it, but it's so heavy on style and very, very thin in terms of characters and in terms of story development. I just don't get anything out of a movie that does not have character depth or complexity. You can have a movie that is exquisitely beautiful to look at, but if there's nothing to get out of it underneath that, then really it's just a beautiful shell. It's empty. And I did mention that Tarantino, if he made a horror movie, it would look like this, but the key word in that, what I just said, is that it would look like this. But obviously, knowing Tarantino, he would do a lot with the characters. And for me, a horror movie does not really have much substance unless it taps into some psychological underlying message or some kind of commentary on society, on human nature. Like, I think that good horror films are able to kind of dig down beneath, you know, this exterior that we have to find our deepest fears and our deepest desires and things that we feel is maybe out of our control in our normal everyday life, and it makes us examine why we bury them beneath the surface. You have a movie like Psycho where you have Marion and even and Norman as well, these characters whose inability to function in society makes them feel like outcasts to those constraints. And then you've got a movie like Repulsion. That's another film where you have a female at the center of it, and she is very sexually repressed, sexually frustrated, and a lot of the misogyny around her is kind of the backdrop and what creates that psychological break within her and causes her to lose her mind. You can see shades of that in Darling, but a lot of this character development, so-called character development, is just hinted at. And I don't mind when things are inferred, but it has to serve the story in a way that works for it. Like, I felt like Midnight Special had that. It had a lot of great ideas, and how immersive it was made the film work in terms of not really understanding a lot of background from the characters. For me, this movie is so thin in terms of its concepts that, to me, that just having those little hints here and there is not firm enough. It's not a firm enough core for me to feel like this was a fully fleshed out piece. I mean, what can you tell from this main character? She's only really referenced to as Darling in the movie, but she's a very lonely character. She may be a bit repressed, and she has this very porcelain-like, very doll-like look to her. Carter gives a really wonderful, unsettling performance, especially because she wasn't given much to work with here. And so I think that she had to build all of it for herself, and she does a really good job. Her eyes are just very, very creepy. I don't feel like the film created that dynamic for her to work off of very well, and it didn't create that psychological turmoil in the way that I wanted it to. In the movie, the mansion that she's in, at the very top floor, there's this room way in the back, a lot like, of course, Rosemary's Baby, and she can't get into it. She can't find a key to it or anything like that. And I think that that could be a metaphor for this cerebral part of herself that she can't tap into and that she's burying on purpose. But what is it? I mean, you don't get any sense of that. The movie starts off on one level, and even though it gets darker and more twisted as it goes on, emotionally, I always felt like it stayed on the same level. There was just no arc to it. And it's very, very frustrating, as I said, because this guy is really good. He has all the talent in the world and the potential to become maybe like a cult horror movie director, but he just needs to have a good script to work off of, and then I think he could do wonders. So I'm kind of torn here. I want to recommend it to people who really, really like horror movies, because even though it's not a very complex film, there's a lot to marvel at in terms of the craft of it. So, I mean, that's who I would recommend it to. But again, I think you'll feel very frustrated by it because it could have been great and it just wasn't. It fell short. So that's my review. Thank you all for listening. If you'd like to follow me on Twitter, the link is below. And you can also like my Facebook page and the link below that one. Catch you next time.